some of the progress that we've made in terms of meeting those targets, and then think about what we need to do over the next 5 years. And as Sarah mentioned, I can come up with these ideas for what needs to happen on the agricultural landscape, but I don't know what it's like out there on the farm. I don't know what the challenges are that you guys are faced with. So it's where it's really important for us to get some feedback from you in terms of what are some things that would help to implement some of these practices, what are some of the challenges. And then what we include in this plan really does help to drive technical support and funding. So that's where I'm really hoping to get some of that feedback from you all. And then again, we'll have Sarah has the survey at the end of this. So in terms of water quality, I'm not sure if folks can see this too much, but we do have a couple of small streams in the watershed that are considered impaired, so that means they don't meet our water quality standards. So there's a stream that flows out of Parker Pond, and then also a small tributary to the Stearns Brook are our only two impaired streams in the watershed. So it's actually pretty good across the state. We have a lot more in other areas of the state. But we have a lot of lakes and ponds in the Memphremagog watershed. And of course, the biggest one is Lake Memphremagog that's impaired for phosphorus. We have two other little ones. One's called Walker Pond, which is up in Coventry. And then we have Mud Pond in Craftsbury, which are two real small ponds that also have elevated phosphorus and nutrient levels related to some agricultural runoff in those next to the wood. And then we have some other water quality issues, some acid deposition that's impacted duck in Halfway Pond, and then some concerns with mercury from atmospheric deposition on Lake Salem. So that's kind of the priorities for water quality in the watershed, but we also have a lot of lakes where we're seeing increasing nutrient trends. So we get out and we monitor a lot of our lakes across this watershed, and we've got about 12 of them in this watershed where we've actually seen some increasing phosphorus levels. So some of these lakes have relatively low phosphorus levels to start off with, but seeing this increasing trend is something that we're concerned about. So we've got areas like that. Mud Pond is one, Shadow Lake, Crystal Lake, Bean Pond, Lake Willoughby. And you can see some of these lakes and ponds have a fair amount of agriculture in the watershed, some do not. So we're really not sure why we're seeing this trend so broadly across these lakes, but it's a concern, and particularly where we see some agriculture in those watersheds, those are areas that we're focused on trying to implement some restoration practices. So I'm going to dive a little bit into our water quality monitoring program. And so this is something that we've been doing, I think, for 12 or 13 years. In this watershed, we've gone out and we've measured phosphorus levels and nitrogen levels in 150 plus sites around this watershed. We essentially started on our larger streams and worked up as we found high phosphorus levels. We tried to figure out where that phosphorus was coming from. In a couple places, we ended up in one spot at the airport with a big gully. But for the most part, where we ended up is at some of the farms up in the watershed where we looked at these high phosphorus levels. And so with that, we shifted over to actually doing some sampling on these farms with Sarah and trying to work and say, okay, we've got some higher phosphorus levels. Where is it coming from? So we tried to work with the farmers and said, okay, what are some of the drainages on the farms? Where might that phosphorus be coming from? And then the really exciting point is looking at, okay, what practices could we put in once we find those high levels? And then going back and evaluating, do we see some improvements after we put some of those in? So this monitoring is much simpler. You can see not the high fancy equipment. We don't have continuous monitors. We do have some great USGS gauges that are helpful in looking at this data. But we actually just get out 6 times a year during regular flow in 2 really good rain events. We try to get out when the water's running off the landscape, which is really when we see most of that phosphorus moving. And we've used this to put together some of our success stories, or Sarah has, I should say. So this is an example with the Morin farm, where we put some practices in place. And this is an example where we sampled above and below the farm, a really small ditch, some really great practices solving some big problems. And before, we saw the phosphorus levels going up between 20 to almost 100 times from above to below the farm. After we put these practices in, that dropped to seeing it still going up by about a factor of 5, but that's a really big improvement in terms of changes over time. And so it's a couple things to note. One is that we're just looking at our concentrations here. This isn't necessarily loading, so it's not 100% pounds of phosphorus necessarily, but it shows that this practice, or these practices, had a big impact on the farm. And we can look at this in a statistical way. We have really high variability in the phosphorus, but we can show that these are actually real changes that we've seen at this time. And so we've done that, and this is probably more information than we need, but we've done this at, I think, 9 farms over the years where we've put in these practices and been able to monitor. And across those farms, there's a total of 17 drainages where we've done some of this analysis. And about 50% of these drainages, we've actually been able to show statistically significant reductions, and those reductions have averaged about 2/3. And so, again, if you had 100 kilograms at the beginning, that's 33 after we put these practices in. So that's a really big change that we're seeing, and it's really nice to me because it gives me a sense that, yes, these practices are actually making a difference on the ground. It's not just modeling. We think these things are making a difference. We actually see it out there. And it's also been really interesting working with some of the farmers, because a couple cases we've done these practices, and we haven't seen improvements. And so there's been a case where it's like actually the filter strip wasn't big enough. So we actually went back and we looked, and right now we're putting in some different practices, and we're going to hope to go back and actually see some differences. Yep?
Were any of these practices including tile drainage?
For the most part, we have not had a lot of tile drainage in areas where we've been doing this work. Okay. So that's not an area that we've really gone into. But we have looked across a couple areas, and I've broken this down. You know, a lot of the areas that we've worked have been around the farmstead, just because that's where, with our water quality monitoring, it's the most easy to pick up where we've got some issues that might be going on there. But we have seen some success in some fields, as well as in the pastures, and then there's a lot of times we've got a combination of those things. So our big focus for me for this tactical basin plan is on Lake Memphremagog. So this is a picture of a blue-green algae bloom. And so that's one of the things, or one of the reasons we're so focused on phosphorus in Lake Memphremagog, is the more phosphorus you have, the more likely those blooms are to happen. And so these graphs, we actually have 3 different monitoring programs on the lake. The little black dots are all the different samples we've taken under each of those. And the red line shows you our target concentration in the lake. And so you see they kind of go up and down. There's definitely some variability there, but we're pretty consistently above our target concentration for the lake, which is 14 micrograms per liter. And we don't really see any real obvious trends in terms of that going down, nor would we necessarily expect to, because it is a really big lake and watershed. So we don't necessarily expect, even though we've done a lot of work in some of these small watersheds, it's not necessarily the scale that we yet expect to see differences in the lake.
Ben?
Yep.
Sorry, so within DEC, when you see these blooms, are you also working with like the storm wastewater programs in the cities and villages that are on the lake? So
yes.
We are figuring out who's...
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And so I'm here today with farmers in the room, so that's really the focus of my conversation today. But a lot of this phosphorus that's going into the lake, we estimate is coming from other sources. So these are some pie charts that we created when we developed the cleanup plan for the lake. So the one on the top is the estimate of what the current loading was when we developed this plan. So we estimated that agricultural fields are about 38% of the phosphorus getting into Lake Memphremagog. The farmstead areas being about 7%. So agriculture as a whole, you know, estimated around 45 to 46% of that phosphorus going into the lake. But we estimated developed lands being about 21% of the phosphorus going in, so that's our roads, our paved areas, our lawns going into the lake. Wastewater treatment facilities, people think about that a lot, but it's actually a very small amount of the phosphorus going into our lake, only about 1% from those wastewater treatment facilities. But we also have a pretty good chunk coming from our streams. So our streams out in the Memphremagog watershed, we have a fair amount of erosion going on those stream systems. All of that sediment brings phosphorus into the lake. And then finally, we do have some phosphorus that washes off those forested landscapes, comes out of our wetlands even, or just falls from the sky into our water. So that's the kind of estimate of what we have in terms of phosphorus coming from the watershed. And to meet our target for the lake, we need to reduce that by about 30%. And so as part of our development of this cleanup plan, we looked at all of the different practices we could implement across the watershed. And it turns out that we have a lot more practices that are available for us on the agricultural landscape. So we ended up with a target reduction across our agricultural fields of about 46%, and a reduction across our farm production areas of 64%. So pretty large reduction targets across those areas, and it's pretty similar to what they have in terms of targets in the Lake Champlain watershed as well. But we do have reduction targets of about 18% from our developed lands, and so that's largely tied to our municipal roads general permit and our stormwater permits. And then we also are looking to reduce the loading on our stream systems by doing riparian buffer plantings and stream restoration projects. So those are the kind of scope of things. And you can see a lot of it is focused on the agricultural landscape, but we're really trying to do some work in those other areas as well. And so these are two of the graphs that are in our Clean Water Performance Report. So every January 15th, we put out this report that kind of tracks all of the phosphorus reduction projects that have been put in across the Lake Memphremagog and Lake Champlain basins. And this graph on the upper right here shows the first line there is our baseline condition, kind of what we did when we developed this study. And then you can see the line in blue is how much we need to reduce that phosphorus over time. And then this little white sliver at the top is how much we track that we've actually reduced that phosphorus based on projects that have been implemented in the watersheds. Overall, we need to reduce phosphorus by about 15 metric tons. And so far, since 2016, we show that we've reduced that by about 1.8 metric tons based on keeping track of all these projects that have been put out there on the landscape. So on the lower left here, you can see it's broken out by the different practices or different areas where you've done those, or achieved those phosphorus reductions. And those areas in light orange, that's all of our agricultural reductions that we've estimated. So the bottom there is our state-funded practices. The middle there is our federally funded practices, so mostly the USDA practices that have achieved those phosphorus reductions. And then the striped lines there at the top are based on our agricultural production areas where we've shown we've been able to meet our water quality, or meet the required agricultural practices. So you can see by far, agricultural practices have met that phosphorus reduction. We've made the most progress across our agricultural landscape. Then above that, that thin green line is where we've done some natural resource restoration projects. Although we expect it's a very thin line now, but we're starting to put a lot more money towards those efforts, so we expect that to grow rapidly over the next couple of years. And then we have our stormwater projects, and again, we have a new permit that's requiring a lot of stormwater treatment, so we expect that to start growing a little bit more over the future years. And then we also have a lot of work that's starting to happen on our municipal roads. But currently, by far, the most progress has been made across the agricultural landscape.
Hey Ben, just
Yep.
interpreting that last, is that 1.8 a year or is that cumulative?
So that's 1.8 per year. So essentially, at the end of the TMDL, each year we need to reduce 15 metric tons per year less than we would have.
Oh, per year. No.
So it's kind of like if we do cover crop one year and we don't do it the next, we haven't made any progress. So that's one of the challenges within the agricultural landscape is most of this phosphorus reduction is coming from those annual field practices. And essentially we have to keep those up if we're going to actually make any progress towards meeting our reductions.
So it's not like you can add those up to the 5 point whatever?
Nope. No, it's each year. Yeah. So there's a couple more graphs here. They're probably hard to see. So over on the left, it's just showing in the green there is our regulatory reductions that are pretty consistently going up over time. In the blue, it's our state-funded practices that's also been going up pretty consistently over time. But we see in terms of our USDA practices, we had some great progress from 2016 to 2019, but we've tapered off over the last couple of years. And so one of the things that we're really focused on with this next planning cycle is what can we do to get back heading in the right direction across those federal programs. So in terms of practices, by far in green there, it's our cover crop. So I think about half of our phosphorus reduction estimated from farms is coming from those cover crops that are being implemented. The next largest practice is crop rotation, although that's the one that you see kind of going up and then starting to head down over time. And I think some of this is that we put in some of these practices and you get credit for a couple of years, and then once those payments stop, you don't necessarily track that. And so that's a really important point here, is that these are all based on practices that are either funded through the state or funded through the federal government. So if you're out there as a farmer and you've done a cover crop but you're not getting paid for it, that's not accounted for at this point in time. So Sarah's looking to start doing that and having some conversations with farmers to figure out what practices might be implemented by the farmer directly, and so that might improve this picture a little bit. So the other thing we can do is look about where these phosphorus reductions are across the Memphremagog watershed. And so, the big point here is just that most of these phosphorus reductions we're seeing have actually taken place in that headwaters to the Black River area. So up around Craftsbury is where we've seen the largest phosphorus reductions. Again, about half of the phosphorus reductions across the agricultural landscape are in just that portion of the watershed. And we have a little bit going on the kind of lower Black River watershed, and then again much smaller across other watersheds across this area. And this kind of is another, probably a little complicated graphic, but it shows our phosphorus reduction target for each of these sub-watersheds that was part of their TMDL. And the areas in yellow are the reductions that we estimate across our field practices. In red is what we estimate across our farmstead practices. So essentially that area in blue is how much more we need to meet across each of these sub-watersheds to meet our TMDL targets. So you can see that lower Black River is where we have our highest phosphorus loading estimate, and we have kind of the biggest, most work to do. We've got some practices implemented, but we have a long way to go. It's interesting if you look at the headwaters to the Black River, if you actually look at the acreage of cropland within that watershed and the amount of cover crop, we estimate that we've got more cover crop than cropland, so we've pretty much maxed out what we can do in that upper watershed. And so that just brings up a really important point, that we really can't meet our phosphorus reductions by cover crops alone. So a lot of our farmland in this watershed is in hay and pasture, so we really need to broaden some of these practices across those other areas of our landscape, and then also look to things like riparian buffers and other practices that go beyond what we achieve in terms of phosphorus reductions from cover crops alone. So we also have kind of the lower Clyde River, the area around Lake Memphremagog itself, and then the Willoughby River is some of the areas where you have the largest gaps to meet up. So those are areas that we're kind of focusing on for this tactical basin plan in terms of trying to generate more interest in terms of implementing some of these best management practices. And then on the right here, it just kind of shows over time how close we're getting to meeting our target reductions across both the field practices, where we're at about 12%, in our production areas where we've gotten up to, I think, 16% of our target reductions. Yep.
So I have a question, and I know that in areas like this, where some farms are going out of business, some other farms will pick up that land. But what is the consideration being given to land that just goes fallow? Or, are weeds considered a cover crop? Is that a good thing? And because eventually it'll grow up to forestry. But I just worry, because I've driven around a lot and seen lands that aren't being used anymore for farming, and what's the implication of that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and we think about that in terms of this cleanup plan in terms of a change in land use. And it's something that's a little bit hard to pick up on, but we do have some new data, and some of the folks that measure or look at the land use across the landscape have started to produce some really useful information about that change over time, where we're seeing some changes in the watershed. And generally what we're seeing is we're seeing a loss of some hayland, a pretty significant amount, but we're seeing a pretty consistent amount of cropland or cornland across the watershed based on those documents. Although they're going to give us information over the last 5 years, it's not really accurate over the last couple of years. So there might be some trends in more recent time that would give us a little bit of a different picture versus that longer term. And essentially what we're going to do is look at some of those things over time and start to, as we get further along in this cleanup process, start to factor in some of those land use changes, and that might make our, if we see more conversion to corn, that's going to make our work a little bit harder. If we see, conversion of corn into what we would call shrub area, you know, you generally have a little bit less phosphorus going off, but we want to maintain sustainable agriculture, so that's not our objective to, that's not the practice that we've included as a way to get to our targets. Yep. Okay, so that's the data. And so a little bit about what I'm doing here as a watershed planner. So again, I work within the Department of Environmental Conservation. Our job in terms of these tactical basin plans, one of our goals is to essentially every 5 years look at how much progress we're making in terms of implementing these cleanup plans. And so the idea is that every 5 years we take a look at where we're at. So we have a period of time where we do monitoring, so we do that out in the stream.